Sinclair Lewis was an American literary giant and a complex cultural figure who became one of the most celebrated and controversial writers of the 20th century. Harry Sinclair Lewis, novelist and social critic, was born in Sauk Center, Minnesota on February 7, 1885. He came from a middle-class professional family. He had a distinctive appearance with his reddish hair and pockmarked face. Lewis's early years were marked by loneliness and intellectual ambition. He attended Yale University, graduating in 1908, though his time there was marked by social awkwardness and literary aspirations. His education shaped his understanding of American society and culture, though his later career would challenge those institutions in the most biting ways imaginable. After graduating from Yale, Lewis embarked on a peripatetic career in journalism and publishing. He worked for various newspapers and magazines, moving from one position to another across the country. He was stationed in New York, California, and Washington, gaining exposure to different regions and social classes. It was during this time that Lewis began developing his ideas about American life and the material to fuel his satirical vision. In 1914, Lewis published his first novel, Our Mr. Wren, a gentle story about a lonely clerk who dreams of adventure. The book attracted little attention and modest sales. He followed this with several more novels in quick succession, including The Trail of the Hawk and The Job. These early works showed promise but lacked the satirical edge that would later define his career. Lewis's early writing career was a struggle. His novels received polite reviews but failed to capture the public imagination. However, despite the modest reception of his early work, Lewis continued to write prolifically. He was a better observer than many of his contemporaries realized. He struggled with finding his authentic voice, balancing commercial considerations with artistic ambitions. By 1920, he had published 5 novels, none of which had made a significant impact. The lack of breakthrough success was frustrating both professionally and personally. Lewis had invested years into his writing career and its slow progress left him uncertain about his future. This period of his life taught him persistence and sharpened his observational skills, qualities that would serve him throughout his later literary career. After years of apprenticeship, Lewis finally found his voice and his audience. In 1920, he published Main Street, a satirical portrait of small-town American life based on his hometown of Sauk Center. The novel told the story of Carol Kennicott, an idealistic young woman who marries a small-town doctor and moves to Gopher Prairie, Minnesota, only to find the town suffocating in its provincialism and conformity. The book was a sensation. It struck a nerve with American readers, selling hundreds of thousands of copies and sparking fierce debates about American values and small-town life. Critics praised Lewis's sharp eye for detail and his ability to capture the speech patterns and attitudes of Middle America. His satirical portrayal of Main Street's narrow-mindedness and cultural poverty resonated with readers who had experienced similar environments. Following the success of Main Street, Lewis was quick to capitalize on his newfound fame. In 1922, he published Babbitt, perhaps his most enduring work. The novel portrayed George F. Babbitt, a prosperous real estate agent in the fictional Midwestern city of Zenith. Babbitt was the quintessential American businessman, a booster and joiner who embodied all the conformity, materialism, and intellectual emptiness that Lewis saw in American middle-class life. The novel was even more successful than Main Street. The name Babbitt entered the American vocabulary as a synonym for mindless conformity and business-class philistinism. Newspapers used the term to describe politicians and businessmen. Lewis's portrayal was so vivid and recognizable that readers across the country claimed to know real-life Babbitts in their own communities. In 1925, Lewis published Warrowsmith, a novel about an idealistic young doctor who struggles to maintain his scientific integrity in the face of commercial pressures and social expectations. This book marked a shift in Lewis's approach. While still satirical, Arrowsmith had a more sympathetic protagonist and a more serious tone than his previous works. The novel explored themes of scientific integrity, medical ethics, and the conflict between pure research and practical application. Arrowsmith was both a critical and commercial success. It was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1926, but Lewis refused the honor. He issued a statement saying that prizes tend to make writers safe and polite, and that he wished to remain free to criticize American life without the constraints of respectability. The refusal was characteristic of Lewis's contrary nature and his suspicion of establishment approval. Lewis's next major work was Elmer Gantry, published in 1927. This novel was his most controversial yet. It told the story of a charlatan preacher who uses religion as a means to power, money, and sexual conquest. Gantry was a hypocrite of the first order, publicly preaching morality while privately indulging in every vice. The novel was a savage attack on religious hypocrisy and the commercialization of faith in America. Elmer Gantry provoked outrage from religious leaders and organizations across the country. Lewis was denounced from pulpits and banned from speaking in certain cities. Some bookstores refused to carry the novel. Yet the controversy only increased sales. The book became a bestseller and further cemented Lewis's reputation as America's most fearless social critic. In 1929, Lewis published Dodsworth, a more mature and sympathetic novel about a retired automobile manufacturer who travels to Europe with his shallow, social-climbing wife. The novel was less satirical than Lewis's previous works, showing more understanding and compassion for its protagonist. It was well received by critics who appreciated the more nuanced characterization and the exploration of American innocence confronting European sophistication. The success of Dodsworth demonstrated that Lewis could write with sympathy as well as satire. The culmination of Lewis's career came in 1930 when he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, the first American to receive this honor. The Swedish Academy praised his vigorous and graphic art of description and his ability to create new types of characters with wit and humor. Lewis accepted the prize, though characteristically he used his acceptance speech to criticize American literary culture and the timidity of American writers. He called for a more honest and courageous American literature, one willing to examine the nation's flaws without sentimentality or patriotic blinders. The Nobel Prize brought Lewis international recognition and secured his place in literary history. However, it also marked the beginning of a long decline in his creative powers and personal life. His subsequent novels never matched the impact or quality of his work from the 1920s. In 1933, Lewis published Ann Vickers, a novel about a social worker that addressed issues of prison reform and women's independence. While commercially successful, it was critically dismissed as inferior to his earlier work. In 1934, he published Work of Art, a novel about the hotel business that was generally regarded as one of his weakest efforts. In 1935, Lewis published It Can't Happen Here, a dystopian novel about the rise of fascism in America. Written in response to the growing threat of fascism in Europe and demagogic politics at home, the novel imagined a fascist takeover of the United States led by a populist politician named Buzz Windrip. The book was timely and politically engaged, but critics found it more propaganda than literature. Nevertheless, it was widely read and adapted for the stage, performing in theaters across the country simultaneously as a statement against fascism. Lewis continued to publish throughout the late 1930s and 1940s, but his later novels were increasingly regarded as pale imitations of his earlier triumphs. The Prodigal Parents in 1938, Bethel Mereday in 1940, Gideon Planished in 1943, Cuss Timberlane in 1945, King's Blood Royal in 1947, and The Godseeker in 1949 all appeared to diminishing critical acclaim. Some of these novels addressed important social issues, particularly racial prejudice in King's Blood Royal, but none captured the cultural moment as his 1920s novels had done. Critics noted that Lewis seemed to be repeating himself, recycling the same satirical techniques without the freshness and energy of his earlier work. Lewis's personal life was as troubled as his later professional career. He had married Grace Livingston Hegier in 1914, and they had one son, Wells Lewis. The marriage was difficult from the start. Lewis was a demanding and often impossible husband, subject to mood swings and increasingly heavy drinking. The couple divorced in 1928. In 1928, Lewis married Dorothy Thompson, a prominent journalist and foreign correspondent. Thompson was a formidable personality in her own right, and for a time the marriage seemed to be a partnership of equals. However, Lewis's drinking and erratic behavior eventually destroyed this relationship as well. They divorced in 1942. Lewis's drinking became increasingly problematic as he aged. He was known for spectacular binges that could last for days or weeks. His behavior when drunk was often embarrassing and sometimes destructive. Friends and colleagues watched helplessly as one of America's greatest writers slowly destroyed himself with alcohol. The drinking affected his work, his relationships, and his health. By the 1940s, Lewis was a shadow of his former self, still productive but no longer producing work of real significance. Throughout his later years, Lewis remained active in public life despite his personal struggles. He gave lectures, participated in political discussions, and maintained his interest in social issues. He was a vocal opponent of fascism and racism, using his celebrity to speak out on controversial issues. He also dabbled in acting and theater, even performing in summer stock productions of his own plays. These theatrical ventures were more hobby than serious artistic endeavor, but they gave Lewis pleasure and allowed him to indulge his love of performance. Lewis's relationship with his sons was complicated and painful. His elder son, Wells, joined the military during World War II and was killed in action in 1944. The loss devastated Lewis, who had been a distant and difficult father. His younger son, Michael, from his marriage to Dorothy Thompson, had a troubled relationship with his father, marked by Lewis's drinking and emotional unavailability. These family tragedies added to the loneliness and isolation of Lewis's later years. In his final years, Lewis lived an increasingly rootless existence. He traveled restlessly between America and Europe, staying in hotels and rented apartments, never settling in one place for long. He continued to write, but his last novel, World So Wide, published posthumously in 1951, was unfinished at his death and showed little of his former power. He was a lonely, sick man, estranged from family and many friends, sustained primarily by alcohol and fading memories of past triumphs. On January 10, 1951, Sinclair Lewis died in Rome, Italy. He was 65 years old. The cause of death was advanced alcoholism and related health complications. He died alone in his hotel room, a sad end for a man who had once been at the center of American literary life. His body was cremated and his ashes were returned to Sauk Center, Minnesota, the town he had satirized in Main Street but never really left behind. Lewis's funeral was a modest affair. He was buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Sauk Center, returning in death to the place that had shaped his imagination and provided the material for his greatest work. In death, as in life, Lewis was remembered with a mixture of admiration and criticism. His legacy is complex and multifaceted. He was a writer of genuine talent and courage who changed American literature by making satire and social criticism central to the American novel. He was honest about American life in ways that many of his contemporaries avoided. He exposed the conformity, materialism, and hypocrisy of middle-class American culture. Yet his service to literature was marked by as many failures as successes in his later years. Modern critics have been somewhat kinder to Lewis than his immediate successors were. They recognize that he was a pioneer who opened up American life to realistic and satirical treatment in ways that influenced generations of writers. They note that his best novels remain readable and relevant, their satire still sharp and their observations still pertinent. They acknowledge that his later decline does not diminish the achievement of his major works from the 1920s. Yet even with these qualifications, the verdict on Lewis's complete career remains mixed. He was a great writer who produced a handful of important novels but who never sustained that greatness throughout his career. Perhaps the most fitting assessment of Sinclair Lewis comes from his own work. His novels were filled with characters who struggled against conformity, who questioned American values, who sought something more authentic than the material success that defined American achievement. Lewis himself was such a figure, a writer who refused to be safe or respectable, who attacked sacred cows and challenged comfortable assumptions. This honesty and courage, while admirable, came at a personal cost that Lewis paid throughout his life. Lewis represents a particular type of American writer, the satirist who achieves great success by criticizing his own culture but who struggles to sustain that critical vision over a long career. History is full of such figures, writers who capture a particular moment perfectly but who find it difficult to evolve and adapt as times change. Lewis's tragedy was that he knew his best work was behind him but was unable to recapture the magic that had made him great. In the end, Sinclair Lewis was neither a perfect writer nor a complete failure, but rather a talented novelist who produced several masterpieces and many lesser works. His legacy includes both Main Street and Babbitt, which remain classics of American literature, as well as numerous forgotten novels from his later years. He is remembered today primarily for his satirical vision of 1920s America and for being the first American Nobel laureate in literature, which is perhaps insufficient recognition for a writer who fundamentally changed how Americans write about themselves. Lewis was in death as in life a man of contradictions, remembered for his literary achievements and his personal failures rather than for the complete picture of a complex artist who both celebrated and criticized his country.